Hi everyone, thanks for being with me. I'm going to talk today about a subject which has concerned me for most of my professional life, and that is this notion around victim blaming. What we experience is that when people are in a situation whereby they are the victim, and often a victim of sexual assault primarily, then we, the community, will take two sides. We'll either understand the experiences that the victim has had, and we will be empathetic and sympathetic towards them, and we will advocate for them in whichever way we can. The other side, which is more horrifying, is that of blaming the victim for whatever it is that has happened to them. It's interesting to note that when a person is a victim in a robbery, for example, that person in the robbery, the victim, is not blamed for the behaviour of the assailant. What does happen, though, is that when we're faced with a victim in terms of sexual assault primarily, and we'll place that in two different categories, where a person is sexually assaulted, raped, an adult raped, usually a woman, then that person is often seen as the victim who will be blamed in whatever way for what has happened to her. Either she's wearing a dress that's too short, she's been in the wrong place at the wrong time, she enticed the person to have a relationship with them when she said she should never have perhaps even said no, or that he misunderstood when she said no, or she didn't say it loud enough, or she didn't say it at all. There's lots of things that happen when we blame other people, the victim, for what happened to them. And then there's that issue around sexual assault of children and pedophilia, where we have certain people in our community who will tend to blame even the child for what has happened to them, or will minimise what has happened in relation to the children. And George Pell, I think, is a good example where society, and particularly some political leaders, Tony Abbott, for example, took a side whereby they wanted to believe George Pell and wanted to tend to blame the victims, children in those cases, for what has happened to them. Now, this has come to my attention because of an article that I read in The Guardian today, and I'm not going to read you through this article, but I'm going to highlight exactly why it was in this particular article that this became to my attention and why it's become so important to me. Not only the fact that I've talked about it for years, but this particular article does discuss this, because it talks about this woman, this person, I think Dean Nelson, was fighting for justice in relation to childhood sexual abuse in Wales. And on many occasions, this person, this journalist, had raised these issues around childhood sexual abuse. And what the journalist noticed was that there was one particular editor who pushed back against all of this. So one morning, a fortnight ago, I checked the BBC headlines to find my old editor, Peter Wilby, peering out. He'd been exposed as a pedophile and convicted of possessing child sexual abuse images. I still feel sick at the discovery. It would be disturbing enough to discover anyone you knew had done anything so terrible. He was convicted of possessing images of children being raped since the 1990s, but Wilby wasn't anymore. He was a pillar of the media establishment, an editor of The Independent on Sunday and the New Statesman and Guardian journalist. So what twigged me about this was that this particular editor apparently pushed back against many of the stories that the journalist had presented to him. This meant that this particular journalist had some issue around those stories because they were exposing pedophilia. A pedophilia which what he was involved in. So he pushed back against that. Now that's probably an extreme case of someone pushing back against and against victims in particular by not allowing their stories to be told as the journalist was intending. So what does that mean about other cases? Well, I just want to take us now to this particular definition, which I think we should really note and pay attention to. Victim blaming occurs, so this is definition of victim blaming. So victim blaming occurs when the victim of a crime or any wrongful act is held entirely or partially at fault for the harm that befell them. There is historical and current prejudice against the victims of domestic violence and sex crimes, such as the greater tendency to blame victims of rape than victims of robbery if victims and perpetrators knew each other prior to the commission of the crime. And of course, when it comes to sexual assault against children, that's a completely different argument and doesn't wash at all. But what it does tell us is that often when people are blaming a victim, whether it be around domestic violence, whether it be around rape, or whether it be sexual assault, it is a strong indicator that the person who is doing the victim blaming has some issues around that issue primarily. Now, with men who are blaming women for domestic violence, then I would suggest that those people have got issues around their own misogyny. For people that try to make excuses for people like George Pell, then I would suggest they even have issues around pedophilia. And I think it's important for us to be able to analyse each of these cases, and whenever we hear someone blaming the victim for what has happened to them, or shifting the blame somewhere else, or not acting upon any inquiry in relation to the crime committed against the victim, then we need to wonder what it is that they're holding. What beliefs do they hold that mean that they are not prepared to follow through on any accusations that may have been made? It is important, I think, for every one of us to understand that there are issues here which need to be addressed, and sometimes we don't see through them. Sometimes we're kind of blinded to whatever is happening, the situation, the context, whatever it is that sits around it, often blinds us. But we need to take action, and we need to think about this issue differently. Because firstly, we need to stop blaming victims, and secondly, we need to look at those people that are blaming victims. What are they holding that would prevent them from seeing the situation for as it really is, the context in which it has been drawn? So what prevents that from happening for these people? It is because they hold certain beliefs which prevent them, which act as a barrier to them seeing actually what is happening to the victim. So they want to blame the victim, and by doing so, protect the perpetrator. So the question for all of us then becomes, why is it that they want to protect the perpetrator? I think we need to think about this. I hope you get a chance to think about it as well. And I'd like to think that you could subscribe to my channel for any more information such as this. And if you like, you can email me on this particular email address. Thanks, everybody. Thanks for being with me. Take care, look after yourselves, and more importantly, be safe.